5 out of 14 banks. Was this in line with your expectations?
Well, the general expectation is that there are 5 banks that appear to have run into trouble with the central bank. Bank PHB is the most significant of those 5. The Spring Bank, which is also a related company, was acquired by Bank PHB sometime recently. And then we have Equatorial Trust Bank, which is dominated by a single investor, who also owns Glo back home in Nigeria. And then you have 2 banks which have regional colorations: Unity Bank, predominantly in the northern parts, and Wema Bank, predominantly a western bank. Those 5 are the institutions that we expect issues with. Some, it does appear that the central bank might be firing the CEOs, and for the others, it just might be some specific actions in terms of capital and liquidity that the central bank would require the owners to carry out.
Now, CBN is providing a further 2 billion naira bailout package to these banks, which brings to total 600 billion naira, which has been pumped into the banking system. Is this adequate, though, in cleaning up the banking sector in Nigeria?
Well, yes, I think so. The first group of banks actually were the bigger ones. That group had 3 banks that were systemically significant. It had 3 banks that had more than 5% of industry deposits and assets. These group are mostly smaller, except for PHB that has acquired market share aggressively in the last few years. The others have lost market share, become fairly marginal. Unity Bank, Wema Bank, Spring Bank, are not as particularly large. Equatorial Trust Bank is even a privately owned bank, is not publicly quoted. So those 4 are essentially fairly small institutions. But PHB, yes, has acquired market share aggressively, and that is why that is likely to be the bank that the central bank would perhaps take more drastic action in regard to.
Talking about drastic action, I mean, when this cleanup process started initially, we as the media were listening to words like sacked, fired, quite harsh action being taken by the CBN, obviously. However, this time around, even the reports that are coming through, for instance, in the case of the CEO of BHP, we're seeing words like resigning instead of being fired. Would you say that the CBN's approach is changing slightly the second time around?
Yes, certainly. Frankly, some of us also felt the first time, while we support the broad policy thrust and the rationale behind the CBN governor's actions, we were worried about compliance with the law, with the constitutional requirements of fair hearing, with the requirements in the Banking and Financial Institutions Decree and CBN Acts in regard to process and procedure precedent to the type of action that the bank has taken. And of course, we were also worried about preventing systemic crisis, such that the actions do not send panic into the market. I think the CBN has learned from that first round. It has tried to do things a little bit more measured. It obviously has taken proper legal advice. It's seeking to comply with all the legal procedure outlined in the law, and essentially is also trying to calm the markets and not take precipitate action. It does seem that in this case, the CBN's preference was for any CEOs who were subject of their actions to be encouraged to resign, and for their boards to appoint the replacements if those CEOs agree to resign. By the way, it does appear that the CEO of Bank PHB says he hasn't resigned, even though he sent a valedictory letter to the staff of the bank. He says he's just sent a thank you letter in anticipation of the CBN's actions.
Opeyemi, just briefly before you go. Opeyemi, just briefly before you go, this process was initiated by CBN in order to consolidate the banking sector in Nigeria. How far are we with that process, and as well as the progress in terms of attracting investors into those banks that have been saved by CBN?
Well, the CBN continues to state that it hopes to see around 15 banks. We have 24 today. I generally support that. I think we need a fairly consolidated industry. I think much of the capital bubbling around in the industry is not real, and if you went to real equity, you would need a smaller number of banks. And I think the CBN will achieve its objectives, because many of these banks, as I've pointed out, are marginal. If their capital erosion is dealt with, they would need significant injections of capital, and they are likely to be subject to takeover. In terms of the cleanup of the industry, well, the CBN, I believe, will achieve its objectives of having a more transparent, better managed, a more credible financial services sector in Nigeria.